and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at one of the largest locos I've ever worked on. This Heljan Garratt steam loco that's been sent in to me for repair by a chap called David. Now, opening the box, there's a bag there full of bits. There's loose detail parts from the locomotive itself, including part of the rotary coal bunker. So removing it from the box, this loco looks to be in quite poor condition at the moment. The cab is loose, there's various details missing or loose, and you can see there on the front drive unit the side rods are broken. As I said, the cab seems to be loose. There's a cab back plate there, boiler back head, and then another part where I'm not sure at the moment where the other bit goes to. I'm going to have a quick look in the brochure to see if I can see where these bits go. It also tells you how to take this apart, how to get to the electrical gubbins by removing a sump like thing underneath the boiler. I'm going to take that off now using these two screws. I do give the loco a quick battery test, but there's no life shown in either of the motors on this model. And there you can quite clearly see the side rods damaged, and the wheel there on the rear is come away from its quartering. So you can see this Garratt is going to take a lot of work to get back into operational condition. So like I said, I'm going to remove this box-like structure underneath the boiler here. I'm not entirely sure what this would have been on the real loco. Maybe the firebox or ash pan. But once this has been removed, you come to a DCC interface, and this has actually got a DCC chip fitted to it. Now, David has provided me with a new Zimo chip to fit to this, so I fitted this to a spare chassis I had, but my gauge master controller would not read it and it wouldn't program. So I believe this chip to be defunct, and it has actually gone in the bin. The two drive units are actually held together with these small multi-pin plugs, so you have to gently manipulate the wires out and then separate these to separate the loco into its three main component parts. Two drive units and this centre part which got the boiler on. The boiler section appears to be full of other sundry wires, one of which, this orange one here, has come adrift from something. So we're going to have to do some investigation into that. There's also an LED in place to try and mimic firebox flicker. But you'll see later that this is a bit futile, and I can't understand why somebody tried to do this. Turning my attention to this drive unit, I'm going to have a look at trying to fix this. Hattons do sell these as spare parts, but they're £75 each. You cannot just buy the wheel sets or side rods alone. You have to buy a whole unit. And as you'll see here by looking at these wheels on the axles, they spin rather freely. There is no grip or friction on these at all. And as you'll see here, these wheels actually slide up and down the axles themselves far too easily for anybody's liking. For a model that cost nearly £300 when it was new, I am gobsmacked at the way this thing has been put together. It just feels cheap and plasticky, with everything being a friction fit. Removing the boiler unit reveals that wire is actually part of a Sueth smoke unit. So I've had a chat with David, and he's agreed to remove all this, as none of it appears to be working, and a couple of the wires are loose, and I'm not sure where they go back to. There's also a speaker fitted, but the stay alive capacitor you can see in front of the speaker there was actually blown and had split on one side, so that again went in the bin. The chimney was just pushed back in place there, and all this extra gubbin, you can see how loose all these wires are. It seems to have been fitted but never actually connected up. And I'm not the best at wiring, so I've agreed with David not to attempt to refit all this, but I will send it back to him, including the speaker and that smoke unit. Now, I said before about that firebox flicker. That weight there that you can see on the chassis plate, that's actually a permanent fixture. So when I put the cab back on later, you'll see that most of the detail in the firebox hole are actually covered and you can't see them. I had to gain access to the motor on these just to check to make sure everything was okay. So with a couple of screws you take the water tank off, and then that metal weight reveals this very small motor which has a drive shaft and flywheel to the centre drive wheel. Having access to the motor allowed me to spin the wheels, and here you can see in this close-up that the actual plastic inserts of the wheels have cracked. This is why they're spinning so freely on the axles. The build quality on this model really is quite poor, and you'll hear me say that 2 or 3 times, because for a model this expensive it was one of the worst I've ever had to work on. So I did talk with David, and I set about attempting to repair these wheels myself instead of spending the £75 for a new unit. Having a look here, you can see that this wheel was also loose on the axle, and none of the pickups are actually touching the wheel backs, which is probably why it wouldn't turn when I tried to give it a battery test. What I'm going to do with this drive unit is I'm going to attempt a fix myself, using a method that I've used before on other locos and has worked relatively well in the past. You can see there just how easy that wheel slides up and down that axle because of that cracked plastic. This buffer on the front here has also been broken off and glued back in entirely the wrong place, so I'm going to break that off, remove all this excess glue and refit that at a later stage. This glue just simply peels off the buffer beam with the aid of them Tweezernose pliers. So I've now took the wheel off the axle at the front of this drive unit, and it allows me to lift the wheel set away, and I'm going to disassemble all this valve gear if I can to gain access to the axles to attempt to repair. These slide bars were easily removed. The piston rod was then gently untangled from all the plastic gubbins, and this was removed. And the linkages was held on by a small piece of wire, which was removed later on. As you can see now, this has given me access in here, and I can clean all this up. Now this front drive axle wouldn't come out of the chassis block. I assume there's a cog on it. I wasn't going to try and disassemble this any further because it really was just not worth it. And I'm going to set the middle wheel there to the 6 o'clock position so I can line up the other wheels on the axles to get the quartering correct. First off, I'm going to clean all the excess grease and dirt off the axles using a cotton bud of methylated spirits to make sure that the ends of the axles are absolutely clean and grease free. This is the only axle I managed to remove in its entirety. The others were cleaned in situ. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix the wheels back onto the axles using some Gorilla Glue 5-minute epoxy resin. Some people might be, it says there, toughest jobs on planet Earth. Well, we'll see about that. But some people might not agree with this method, but I've used this 2 or 3 times before and it hasn't let me down yet. So working extremely carefully, you put a small amount of adhesive inside the wheels and then place them on the axles and leave the one side to set. Quartering at this point doesn't really matter because you can turn the wheels and axles quite freely. I then had to quarter them correctly using the other side. So now that the glue's thoroughly dried, if I put one set of wheels in the 9 o'clock position and make sure that all 3 line up, if I turn it round, all 3 should be in the 6 o'clock position, which they are. So I'm pretty certain that the quartering is correct on this now. Now it's time to reassemble all the side rods, and using the other drive unit as a reference, everything was put back in place. And this is, again, I found another problem with this model. Everything is just a push friction fit. There are no crank pins or screws holding these side rods together, and it really is quite a poor design. Friction fit models would have been okay 30 or 40 years ago, but this is really poor considering how new this model is. The push fit crank pins were put in place and they were gently forced back into place, and everything else, including the slide bars and piston rods, were put in afterwards. It really was quite fiddly getting all this to work properly, and I used the Tweezernose pliers just to gently persuade everything to go back where it should do. I'm hoping that when we've reassembled this will be a nice neat fix, and it will save David a few pennies in the repair of this model. The slide bar there and the piston rod was then put in. I'm just putting that linkage in the top there of the cylinders, and the same was repeated for the other side. I do apologise for some of the jumpy footage in this. I've had this Loco for several months attempting to repair, and it was because of the fragile and rubbish nature this was assembled in the first place, which is why it took me so long. because I just kept losing impetus with it. But alas, after the repair, this centre crank pin wouldn't stay in. You can see on the wheel there that the centre hole is perfectly circle. It's because the plastic has worn away, and this should actually be a half moon shape to allow the crank pin to push in place and sit firm. But the plastic had worn and broken away, so I had no choice but to order a £75 spare part from Hatton's. And here it is, after a few weeks it has arrived. So I'm unpacking this now on the camera. I've not seen this unit before. I unpacked it here, and it was well packaged. But when I unravel it, the first thing I notice is that the water filler cap is missing, even though it was present on the pictures. And everything looks to be in good order. There's the wiring connection there. There's no magnet either. There needs to be a magnet on it. But then horror upon horrors, when I turn it round, I see that the sidebars on this model are damaged. Hattons have sent me a damaged model. Now, I did phone Hattons and they offered to send me a replacement, but only when they received this. I'm just checking the wheel there because I thought it had gone out of quarter. So I thought I'd try and attempt to repair this myself, and luckily it was just a case that the slide bars had come out of their plastic holding. But for £75, I really did expect better quality and better service. These haven't been quality control checked, as there's no way that's been damaged in that parcel, as it was just too well wrapped and protected. So once I've manipulated those slide bars back into where they should be, I'm going to hook this up to the main electronic components in the middle part of the Loco, which are situated in that boiler section, and give it a test run. But upon looking at this part as well, none of the pickups were in line with the wheel backs, and they needed to be adjusted. These micro connectors only go in one way, so gentle persuasion clips that into place, and then turning it upside down and using a battery power, you can see there that this motor drive unit works very nicely, and the side rods are now going round as they should after I've repaired that slide bar damage. I'm now going to refit the rotary coal bunker part with this. This is just held in place with one screw at the front there, which should be hidden by that water filler cap. Now, there was one missing when David gave me the model, so I'm going to have to scratch build one later on. Here I am now just testing the model. I'm trying to work out which of the pickups need adjusting, and as you'll see, there are quite a few, as it's only picking up from one wheel on that drive unit on the right hand side. You can see there that both are spinning quite nicely. The handrails on the other drive unit, this is David's original one, this also had a buffer that was broken off and glued in the wrong place. But the handrails on this unit were all coming off, so I pulled them out of their housings and just applied a very, very tiny amount of super glue with a cocktail stick and just pushed them back into place to hold them firm. Again, it's more friction fit details, and this model really was let down by this. Everything on this model is friction fit. The buffers, the handrails, the side rods. The only thing that was screwed into place was the cab and that underslung firebox or ash pan that goes under the boiler. Here's the original filler cap from David's model, so I'm going to push that into place now everything's screwed back in. And that's the original drive unit sorted. I'm just going to put a small amount of super glue with a cocktail stick there to push the buffer into the buffer housing where it should be, making sure that it's the correct way up, as there is a small rectangular step on top of the buffer, and obviously this faces upwards. Once that was in place and correctly aligned, the glue was left to thoroughly harden overnight, and I returned to it the next day. Now I'm going to turn my attention to the replacement drive unit, which I've put the rotary coal bunker detail on, and we're going to try and mend this part that had come loose. So this obviously fits on here, and there's a handrail towards the bottom there that slots through a small hole, and I put this in place and then I actually seal it in with the satin varnish technique, so that if anybody needs to take it off in the future, they can do. Although I don't see why you'd need to take it off, but at least it's now secured. You can see there that baffle plate was quite loose, so that was also glued in place. I've just noticed now that on the original drive unit, one of the wires has come loose off the connector. the solder tab is actually broken, so I'm going to have to repair this as well. Like I said, this model, for the amount of money that Hatton's charge for these when they were new, it really is not good quality at all. I have not dealt with any Heljan steam locos before. I don't own any. I own plenty of their diesels and they tend to be pretty solid, but this steam locomotive is pretty poor in my opinion. While I've soldered that wire back on, I'm now adjusting all the pickups, and this took quite some time. Using a pair of long nose tweezers, I'm just bending the brass to make sure that all the pickups on this model are in touch with the wheel backs. For a model that's got so many wheels on it, it's disappointing to see that only 4 out of the 8 wheels on each drive unit actually pick up electric current. The first and last set of driving wheels, the middle set of wheels, doesn't collect any current at all, nor do the pony trucks. This is an oversight in my opinion from Heljan, and it could have improved performance no end. Now I'm going to turn my attention back to the other details on the cab. This, as I said before, this metal block here is in the way, and they've gone to the trouble of fully detailing that cab. But once this is in place, you lose a lot of that detail. It just sits in front of the firebox, and again, that's another reason I can't understand why they wanted firebox flicker. You can't actually see it. The cab is secured in place with a screw from the underside, and luckily David has provided some spare screws in that bag. So I go to tighten this up, and I think everything's okay, so I move on to the next bit. But this won't be the first time we see that cab screw. This part here that I didn't know what it was, is broken. It actually comes there because that mark there matches the one underneath. So because it's been broken in the box, I'm going to fix that plastic lip on it there with some plastic weld cement. Just using a little bit, as this spreads quite easily through capillary action. Hold the part in place until the glue's dry, and then a small spot of super glue on that die-cast chassis there, and I glue this back into place and use a small clamp to hold it in place while the glue thoroughly sets. Some of the details on this model are actually quite nice, and it really is a shame that that cab detail is so hidden, as they've gone to the trouble of producing it all, and it really does look quite nice really. So as I said, now that's glued in place, I'm going to put a small clamp on it just to hold it in place. And again, the Garratt was left for several hours for the glue to set, and I turned my attention to something else, as I did find this Loco quite frustrating to work on. Here we are with the, this is the Zimmo decoder that David's provided, so I'm going to fit that shortly. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to fix this rotary coal bunker piece back into place using some satin varnish, and there we go. When it's all dry, you can see there that it's held in place quite nicely. What I'm going to do now is, in my spares box, I found this old Lima buffer, which is about the size of a water filler cap. So again, using some satin varnish, I'm going to put some around the rim of the hole and then push the buffer into it and leave it to dry, so it acts as a water filler cap. But the satin varnish provides a good enough bond to hold it in place, but it's weak enough to break should this ever need to be taken off and the body on this part unscrewed and removed again. Now here we are again with the cab. As I said, that we put this screw in earlier, but when I turn the model round and onto the bench, as you'll see now, that screw is actually too small for the hole, and it just lifts out. It's not doing anything whatsoever. So I search through the box and there's no other spare screws, so I actually get my spare screw tub out and root through these spare screws to see if I can find a screw short and wide enough to fit the hole without damaging the plastic. This was quite a tall order, as it needs to be quite a wide screw but also very stubby. Luckily I found a screw with a flat head on it that was both short and quite wide, so it holds the cab in place now quite nicely without damaging any of the plastic. Now it's time to reassemble the model into its 3 pieces to make sure and give it a test run. So again, these micro connectors were gently pushed back in place, and then the wiring was forced through that small hole into the boiler cavity. the drive units fit into that die-cast hole there, and the magnets allegedly hold them in place. Although this was quite difficult to work on, so I resorted to put it into my Loco cradle to put the drive units back on. I test it with a battery now, and as you can see, now I've adjusted the pickups and serviced both the motors, it is attempting to run there. So putting a bit more power on with leads from a controller, and you can see that it's running quite nicely. With power applied to one set of wheels, I clean all the wheels on the Garratt using my usual method, and you can see there that they are quite filthy. So the wheel backs were polished as well. I initially use a cotton bud of methylated spirits and then polish them up with the fiberglass pencil, and then finish off by polishing the remnants off with another cotton bud of methylated spirits, so that all the wheels on this Garratt are now squeaky clean for good electrical pickup. Now it's time using some tweezers to try and shoehorn all these wires back into that boiler cavity, and then I'll fit the DCC decoder and then the ash pan or sump detail that goes underneath it. Just making sure there that the orange wire is in pin number 1. And then this Zimmo decoder all fits in quite neatly. And there are cutouts on this part to allow the wires to pass through. So you have to line them up with the cutouts and then screw this down to hold everything in place. Apologies there, I knocked the camera stand, which is wobbling quite a lot. But once, it took a while getting all those wires in there. Once they're all in, it was just a case of tightening the 2 screws up. And then the Garratt has been reassembled and hopefully is back into running order. Although upon investigation, I'm not entirely sure how long the original drive unit will last. This part here was loose and left over, so I'm going to have to consult pictures online to see where that bit came from. But yeah, hopefully the original drive unit will last, because otherwise, if I'd have had to buy 2 drive units for this Loco, it would have made it beyond economic repair. For as £150 for 2 spare drive units, these models generally sell on eBay now for about £200. So just fitting it all up there as it should be, this monstrous Loco is almost done. But again, as has been got the current theme through this Trash to Track, as I was putting it together, I'm just having a look there to make sure everything's correct, and I'm also trying to find out where that loose pipe goes, but to no avail. I do eventually find out, but I had to resort to Google and saw several images online to find out where it came from. But as I was saying, I put this back together, and while it was on my workbench, I noticed that yet another part has fallen off due to the lack of adhesive, and this part goes underneath that rotary coal bunker. So this is going to have to be glued back on again. This Loco, like I said, I don't like moaning about them, but the build quality on this model was lacking. It was very, very poor. It looks like a good model detail-wise, but construction-wise, I think I'd have to avoid it if I was buying one myself. Here we see the Garratt on its first tentative test run on my layout under DCC control. First it was going quite slowly to bed that new drive unit in, and then it had a leg stretch in the garden. If you've got a locomotive or stock you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, or you're in need of repair, please contact me at the email address on screen, and we'll have a look and get it sent over for repair. And who knows, it may feature in a Trash to Track episode all of its own. I am pleased we got this Garratt back to running order, and it was quite a frustrating rebuild. But it's on its way back to David now, and I hope he's happy with it in the future. Thanks again for watching Trash to Track. Please like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you again in the next video. Bye for now.